So as most of you know, this project was originally built with the purpose of building a REST API so that we could then build an app to interact with it. So we've pretty much built the REST API. It's complete, mostly complete for those of you who've been following along. But now we need to make just some minor adjustments to prepare for the Android app. There's just some responses that need to be updated, some serializers that need some minor changes, just some minor things that we need to kind of patch the course before we actually go and build the Android app. So in this video, I'm going to try and cram all of that stuff into a single video, all of sort of the small updates to the serializers and the views and things like that before we move on to build the Android app. So I expect this to be quite a long video. I got a lot of corrections. Well, I don't want to say corrections, just kind of updates. We got to update the code to make sure that it's ready for the REST API and the Android app. So I expect it to be a long video, so kind of get ready for that. And I'm going to cram it all into one video, as I said, so we can then move on to build the Android app for the powerful Android apps with Jetpack Architecture course. In front of me here is the code for the last video, the previous video for the REST API, and now we're going to patch that and just make some minor adjustments. So for those of you who watched that REST API course, it's going to be the branch. It was user account serializer. That was the previous branch. And now we're going to continue on from that point and just make some changes to a bunch of serializers and views to prepare for the Android app that we're going to be building. So the first change that we need to make is into the account app, go into API, go into views, and scroll down to the bottom, and we're going to make a custom view for logging in. The reason we want to make a custom view for logging in and not just use the built-in Django one that we've been using previously is we need to customize the response that's being returned. So let's build this. And just so you know, for most of this video, I'm going to be copy pasting in a lot of code because I have a lot of things I want to get done and move on to the Android app. So I'm going to paste in the code and we're just going to walk through it because it's going to take way less time to do that. So here's the gist for the update I'm about to make. And just so you know, all of the gists that I reference in this video, I'm going to put a link to all of them in the description. They'll be ordered in the order that I go through them, so it should be easy for you to just grab them and copy paste. So the first one is let's grab these imports and grab this new view. So I'm copying that, going back to Sublime Text, and I'm going to paste that in. I'm going to grab these imports and I'm going to move them to the very top of the file. So just pasting those in up there. Now coming down, what do we got here? We have a new view that extends the API view class. I'm passing nothing for the authentication classes, nothing for the permission classes. That means that anybody should be able to use this view. We don't need to be authenticated. We don't need permission. And it's going to override the post function. So it has to be a post request. So all we're doing is we're getting the email, the password, and then creating or authenticating using that email and password using the authenticate method, which I imported at the top here. There's authenticate. And if we scroll down, let's see what else. So it says if the account, I'm just going to give myself some more room here. If the account exists, then we want to return a response. So we want to get the token. If there is a token, if there isn't a token, then we create one. So these tokens, remember, they're going to be used for authentication with the app. The token basically denotes what it means to be authenticated. They're going to be attached to all the requests that we make to the server. Then we want to return a response. So we're creating a context variable, adding some parameters. So the response is successfully authenticated. We want to return the primary key, the email, and the token. If they do not have an account, so else we'll handle that right here. The response will be error, and then the error message will say invalid credentials. And these responses are really important because in the Android app, when we try to authenticate, basically all this error handling is going to be handled on the server side. That way we don't have to do this with the client on the Android app. And it's much easier this way because then we can just read the response from the server. If it's an error, post a dialog or a toast, whatever. If it's not an error, then we can read the successful message. So these responses are really important. Make sure to copy these exactly. And that's another reason why I wanted to use these gists and have you copy paste them. And actually, just to show you an example of what I'm talking about with these responses, I'm going to actually show you a demo here. So here's the app that we're building in the OpenAPI Android app, the powerful Android apps with Jetpack Architecture course. I'm going to try and log in with some invalid credentials. So I'll just say mitch@tavian.ca, but I'll type like a random password, and I'm going to try and log in and see what happens. It says error invalid credentials. So that right here is the exact error message. So you can see how important these error messages are because that's what's actually going to be displayed by the Android app. It checks the response, it gets either the error or the success message, and then acts accordingly. So making sure that these are exactly the same as what I'm showing you in this video is very important. So make sure you copy paste from the gist like I'm saying. Okay, so I'm going to press Control S. I'm going to save that, and we are going to go into urls.py now. So we need to import this new view. So I'm just going to copy the name of the view, go to the next line, paste that in, and now we need to add this, or we need to change this. So grab this open API view, I'm going to paste that in, do as view, because remember that's what we had to do with class-based views. I'm going to delete this obtain API token import. We don't need this anymore because we've built a custom view for that, and that should be good. One last thing that I do want to point out before we move on is go back into views and notice this heading that I pasted above here. So if you take a look at the source code for this project for the REST API, you'll notice that above every API request or view, I put a gist that points to what the response is going to look like, so the format of the response, and then also the URL that corresponds to that view. So let's just, as an example, if you're confused by what I mean, I copied that gist and now I'm going to paste it in the browser. So these are the responses that you can expect to see from that particular view. So if it's a successful response, it'll look like this: successfully authenticated, maybe print out a primary key, print out a token, print out the email. If it fails, then you'll get response, error message, invalid credentials. So that's what's being printed out from this right here. So if you ever are confused about what the response is going to look like, what the URL is, just take a look above the view and there'll be a gist that you can just take a look at. So I did that just to kind of clarify any confusion that any of you might have. So now that we've made a change, let's test this change before we moved on. So here I have a command prompt open. I have my virtual environment running, as you can see here. Now I'm going to run the server, and we can test this and make sure that it's working correctly. So I'm going to my browser. I'm going to go to the Django admin. Notice I already have a tokens table because I've done this ahead of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the token associated with a user, which is this one right here. So I'm going to delete this token. Just go to delete, and what I'm testing here is when I log in, a token should be generated. That's what this view does. When they log in, if a token exists, it will just get the token and return it. If it doesn't exist, then it will create one. So that's what we want to test. So let's go to the browser. That token was deleted. I'm going to open up Postman, and I'm going to try to log in. So I know I've already got a login response in one, or a login right here. So we have a post request, we have API account login, and let's take a look at the body. We'll do username mitch@tavian.ca, password is password, and we'll click send. Let's see what happens. So it says successfully authenticated. We get the email and we get the token. So that's good. It's being generated. Everything is good. Let's confirm that a new token was generated in our database. So if I refresh that, there's the user and then there's that token. So that's good. Everything's working correctly. Now we can move on to the next part. Next, we need to work on one of the blog post serializers. So I'm going to close both of these. We can minimize this, go into blog, API, and serializers, and we need to update this blog post serializer. So we need to do a couple things to this. Number one is we need to add some fields to this list of fields that are going to be returned. We need to add the primary key, and we need to add the slug. So I'm going to add the slug over here. Those are going to be needed for the app. That's why I need to add them here. They need to be included in the response. Now, currently, the way this is, when it returns an image, when it returns a response from the server, it will actually, when you actually do it in production, the image returned from AWS has some weird signature. So I can't actually show you because I'll just query a blog post. Invalid token. Let me just grab a valid token. Grab this. Go to headers, paste in that token. So that returns nothing because there's no blog post. All right, I wasn't prepared for this, but I wanted to show you. So let me just click one of these. You don't worry about what I'm doing. Just kind of just watch because I just want to illustrate something. So there's a blog post. So when I do this on the test server, it just returns a URL pointing to where that image is stored in the media folder inside of the project. So inside the project, there's just that media folder where we store all of the image files. Nothing special there. But with in production, where we have this stored is in AWS. So through DigitalOcean, we have it using AWS, and that's where the images are being served from. So the problem with that is when you do it in production, I'll show you an example of what is happening. So you would have, you'd have AWS dot to whatever the spaces thing is, and then you'd have like your image, your folder, wherever it's being stored. But then at the end of it, there's like a signature. It's like some kind of a it's like I don't even know. It's like some kind of a request signature that gets attached to it. And then it's like some big long string of characters. So this signature, I don't actually know what it does, but it gets attached to every request when you try and look at an image. And this is a problem. It's a problem because in the Android app, when we use Glide to cache the images, Glide remembers the URL and then remembers the image that's associated with that URL. But if the signature changes every time you look at that image, it's not going to cache it properly. And also that gets saved in room, so they're all going to be different basically. So we need to remove this signature because it doesn't actually, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. It doesn't actually do anything. So we need to remove that from the URL that's returned from the server. And I don't really want to explain this anymore because if for me to show you this, I would have to make changes in the production server and then show it to you. And I just want to get this video done and move on to the Android app. So just trust me that there is some kind of weird signature that's attached to it and we need to remove it. So that's what we're going to do. So that's what this next part here is going to be about. So I need to create a new field here. It's going to be for the image field. It's going to be serializer method field. So we're going to use another serializer method field. This one's going to be called validate image URL. And we're just going to change what's returned just like we did with the username. So remember, we wanted to be able to get the username of the author of the blog post. So we had to create this serializer method field to alter that before it got returned. We're going to do the same thing with the image because we just want to remove that signature that's returned from AWS. So I want to do self. It's going to take the blog post, just like the get username from author serializer method field, sorry. So I want to do image equals blogpost.image, and I want to do new URL equals image.url. Whoops, just need to be, so just getting the URL from the image. Now we want to remove that question mark. So anything after the question mark. So if question mark is in the new URL, then we want to remove it. So new URL equals image.url. And I want to write :image.url.rfind, and I want to look for that. So that will remove it. So I'm setting the new URL to the same thing, but without the question mark. I'll move my mouse here so you can see that. And then I just want to return that new URL. That's all we're going to do. Pressing Control S, and that's going to, if there's a question mark present in the request, like I showed you, and then anything after that, so that big long string of characters and numbers will get removed so that we just see the image. Well, so that we just see the image minus the signature anyway. So I can't really test this. I could, I guess, like go into the database and like manually change the image and add a question mark or something to test it, but just take my word for it. Because I don't want to. I want to get this video done so we can move on to the app. Take my word for it. This will work. It will remove the signature. Everything will be good. All will be good. Alternatively, what you could do is if you wanted to see this, you could just comment this out, and then later when you look at your production server, test it, and you'll see the signature returned from the images, and then uncomment this and put it back in, and then you'll see the signature is removed. So do whichever you like, but I'm trying to move forward here. Next, we need to create a new serializer for updating blog posts. And we need to create a new one. We can't use this BlogPostSerializer like we were doing before because we only want to update certain fields. And this by default is hard to get this serializer to work properly when you reference all these fields. So we're just going to create a completely new serializer. That way we can customize it and it'll work great. Because we also want to limit the size of the images, the dimension of the images. There's a bunch of custom logic that we need to do, so it's just easier to build a brand new serializer. So, I don't know if I mentioned the fields that we are going to be updating are only the title, the body, and the title, body, and image. Those are the only three fields that we want to be updated. Whereas with the blog post serializer, there's all of these fields that could be returned or potentially updated, which we don't want the user to be able to do that. So yet again, I have another gist. There'll be a link to this gist in the description like the other one. And we have a couple things we need to copy here. So the first one is this blog post update serializer. So I'm going to copy everything here, and it looks quite long, but it's pretty simple actually. So I'm pasting that in. I'm going to grab all this stuff, all the imports, and move that to the top of the file. So what is happening here? What is with this blog post or blog post update serializer? Well, as I said, you're going to be updating the title, the body, and the image. So those are the only three fields that are mentioned in the meta class. Then we have a method or a function named validate, which is going to be used to validate the parameters of the updates. So if you ever want to create a serializer and you want the certain things to be validated before that the object is saved to the database, you override the validate method, and then you can write some custom logic in here. So all that we're going to do is we're checking the title first of all, making sure that the title is of a certain minimum length, which that constant is defined up here. So the title has to be more than 5 characters long. Next is the body. So the same thing, making sure that the body is above a certain minimum. That minimum is again defined up here, so 50 characters. So there has to be 50 characters in the body to make it valid. And then we're moving on to validate the image. So validating the title, validating the body, and then we're going to validate the image. So by what we're doing to validate the image is we're actually saving a copy of the image that they're trying to update locally to AWS, and then we're going to read that image and make sure that it meets certain criteria. That's what all of this kind of logic here is for. So we're going to just kind of walk through this. So first, it saves this image to the storage. So that's what this is all about. It gets a URL, gets a reference to the storage using file system storage, and then it saves it to a temporary directory. So the temporary directory is this settings.temp. So it creates a temporary directory on the storage and then saves that image to that temporary directory. And in order for this to work, we actually need to create that because we don't have that in our project right now. So if I go to CodingWithMitch blog course, go into source, there actually is a temporary directory. So just make sure that you create a new folder named temp. So if you don't see a temp folder right here, I'll actually delete this just so I'm seeing exactly what you're seeing. You're going to want to do, if you're on Windows, Control-Shift-N to create a new folder and just name that temp, because that's where your image is going to be saved so that it can be looked at and analyzed. If you're doing this in production, actually in production you'll need to do this too. So make sure that on your server, when you FTP, you'll have to create a temp folder there because that's where it's going to be saved. I think earlier I said that it was going to be saved to AWS, but actually it's saved on the server. So make sure you create a temporary directory on your server in the same place that everything else is. So wherever all of this stuff is on your server, create that temp directory. So it gets the file, it saves the image, and then it confirms that the image isn't too big. So you can see it checks this image size max bytes, and that constant's defined up here. So 2 megabytes, the image cannot be larger than 2 megabytes. If it is, it says the image is too large. Images must be less than, this should be actually 2. Try a different image. So just raises an error there. Next, it looks at the image and looks at the aspect ratio. So it gets the dimensions, which gives the height and the width, and then we can check the aspect ratio. So we get dimension 1, which is the height, dimension 0, which is the width, divides them, and make sure that the aspect ratio is less than 1, because we don't want the height bigger than the width. So this is the same thing that Instagram does, I believe, when they upload images, because you can't they have to like fit a certain aspect ratio, and if it doesn't, then it fills it in with white space, it looks like. So this is the same kind of thing. We don't want really long images on our server because they look stupid in an app. We want to make sure that no matter what, at most it's going to be the same height by the same width. They can be as wide as you want, that's fine, but we don't want them super long. Long is the problem here. So I hit my mic for those of you who didn't see that. I just got to fix it. So that's how we confirm that the images are the correct dimensions that we want to allow on the server. Then we want to remove that previous temporary image. We don't need that anymore. And then if it passes all of these tests, then we return the blog post. Otherwise, it'll see some kind of an error. So pretty simple, just pressing Control S now to save that. And now we need to update the view that's going to be using that serializer. So I'm going to go into views.py, scroll down to the API update blog view. Actually, before we scroll down, we need to import that new serializer. So I'm copying the BlogPostUpdateSerializer and writing comma inside the view and then getting that. So now we scroll down to API update blog view, and we need to update this view a little bit. So again, let's refer to the gist because there's quite a bit of updates. So going to that same gist that I just had open, and I've created this new view for you here. So I'm copying this whole thing. You can see API update blog view, going back to Sublime text, and I'm going to paste that in, and we'll just walk through these updates here. So it's mostly the same. The first thing you're checking is to make sure that the blog post exists. That's what this little block is here. Making sure that the user that's trying to update it is the user who is the author. So it's just checking if it's the author. If it's not, it says you don't have permission. Pretty straightforward. Checking to make sure that their request is a put request. It's then using our new blog post update serializer, passing the blog post, passing the data that they're trying to update, and setting partial equal to true. So partial equal to true, what does that mean? That means that it's giving it permission, the serializer permission, to only update the fields partially if some of the other fields aren't included. So that sounds confusing. What it means is if they only update the title and they don't include an image and a body, that's fine. We don't care. That's what partial equals true means. It means that you don't have to include all of these in the request. So if we take a look at Postman, and let me just see if I can find an update. So if I was to try and update all three, that's fine. But also, if I only had the title and the body, that would also be fine. The image would not be changed. That's what the partial equal to true does. So minimizing that. And we also need to, in order for that to work, for the partial equal to true to work, we need to be able to update the model partially too. So if I go into the blog post model, we also need to make sure that blank is equal to true for the title, blank is equal to true for the body, and blank is equal to true for the image. Those three need to be set to in order for that partial update to work also. So I'm gonna press Control S on the view, Control S on the model, Control S on serializer, and just finish going through this. So now if the serializer is valid, we want to save the serializer, and then we want to create the response. So here is the response. We have update success. We want to print out the primary key, the title, the body, the slug, date updated, and then also the image URL. And this logic here, this little bit of logic here is for removing that signature that I talked about in the previous part. So remember when we were working on the blog post serializer, we wanted to remove that signature from Amazon, from AWS. That's the same kind of thing I'm doing here. So I'm getting the URL just with this line of code here, checking to see if there's a question mark in that URL. If there is, I'm removing it, and then I'm setting that to return that image, and then the username, and then just returning that data. So let's try to do an update just so you can see what the response is looking like. So I'll copy one of these URLs that we were looking at previously. Going to put that in there. I gotta make sure I have the correct token, so I'm copying that, putting that in. So we have so suppose I'm just trying to update the title and the body. Let's actually open the server. So it should be this blog post right here that we're dealing with. So let's open Postman, and I'll try to make an update. So the title should get changed to, I'll make it similar. So let's actually copy this, put this title in here, take this description, put this description in here. So what we expect to see is a bunch of periods appended to the body and an exclamation mark appended to the title. So let's click send. It says enter a body longer than 50 characters. I'm just going to type a bunch of random stuff just so it meets the criteria. Hit send. And there we go. There is our blog post response for the update. So now I will try and change the image. So notice that worked. That's good. Now let's try and change the image. I'm going to go to File, and I'll test a bunch of images. I'll test some ones that don't work. So here I have a whole bunch of images. So remember we set that criteria that the length can't be longer than the width, and also it can't be above a certain size. So let's try this one. So notice that this length is clearly longer than the width, and it's also bigger. It's 2.13 megabytes. So we expect this not to work. So I'm going to click that, click send, and let's see what it says. It says settings object has no attribute temp. So we actually forgot to do something. I forgot to add that temp directory, the pointer to the temp directory in the settings file. So we need to do that. So let's go back to the project, open up settings.py. So I'm going to my site, going into settings. I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom, and we need to add a temp directory here, or a reference to that temp directory. So I'm just writing temp and setting that equal to os.path.join. Join the base directory, and this is named temp. So just a pointer to that temp directory that we created, this one right here. That's all that is. We need to do that because in the view, in the serializer, you'll see right, where is it? it references that settings.temp. So that's referencing that temp directory. So I pressed Control S, that's saved. Now let's go back to Postman and let's try that again, clicking send. It says that image is too large, so that's good. It's correctly seeing our restrictions. So let's choose a different one, maybe this one. Let me see how big this one is. This one's okay, so this one's the right size. You can see it's only 395 kilobytes, but the height is clearly larger than the width. So this shouldn't work. This also shouldn't work, but for a different reason. It says image height must not exceed width. Okay, good. So that's all good too. Now let's try one that should work. I think this was the original. So you can see the size is good. You can see that the width was larger than the height. If I click send, it should see an update. And there we go, that actually does update. So our criteria are all working, our response looks good. If I refresh this, there's our blog post. So that's it, now we're ready to move on to the next part. The next serializer that we need to update is for creating blog posts. So if you can imagine what these are going to be used for, the BlogPostSerializer, the original one, is just for retrieving blog post objects and looking at them. The UpdateSerializer is for updating them. Now we're going to create one for creating blog posts. And the create one is going to be very similar to the BlogPostUpdateSerializer. It's only going to have a few differences, which I'm going to talk about when we actually make it here. So I created a gist like I did with the other ones. Is this it right here? Yeah, this one. So BlogPostCreateSerializer, again, links will be in the description. Let's do the same sort of thing. And again, this is going to look very similar. So I'm copying the serializer, going to Sublime Text, pasting that in, and let's take a look. So the only differences here are the fields. When we create a blog post, we need more fields for one thing. So the title, the body, the image, but we also need the date updated, and we also need the author. So with the update, we already would know the author because they'd be authenticated, and the date updated is done automatically. So these are the fields that we need for creating them. And then the second difference is going to be, instead of overriding or adding the validate function, we have a save function, because with the update, we need to validate before we save, because we need to confirm that the updates are valid. With the create serializer, we're just going to do the validation inside of the save method, because that blog post doesn't exist already. So we can validate in the save method. If it doesn't meet the criteria, we just don't save it, and that's fine. So that's why we're able to use the save method. So walking through this, it's mostly the same. We have, our image again, we have our title, again, checking the length of the title, checking the length of the body. Then when we have those parameters, we then create a new blog post object where the author we get from the request. We get the title, the body, and the image, which we just set up here. Next, we're doing the same thing for the image validation. So saving a temporary image, checking the size, checking to make sure that the aspect ratio is correct. Also, let me see, this should be 2 megabytes. The gist is wrong, I should update that. Checking the aspect ratio. When that's all done, we remove the previous image, and then we save it and we return the blog post. If something goes wrong, then we throw this key error right here, and it says you must have a title, some content, and an image. So that's I guess the third difference is with the update, we are allowing a partial update, so they don't have to have the title, the body, and the image. With the update, we can have, remember we talked about those that parameter, the partial equal to true. But with the creating a new blog post, we need all of those parameters. So if one of these parameters is missing, you notice that I'm inside this try catch block here. If one of those parameters is missing, it will throw a key error, and then it will give the user some feedback that says you must have a title, content, and an image. So that's how we are confirming that they're entering everything that they need when they're creating a new blog post. Oh, actually, one last thing I need to talk about for those of you who are following along, because this will definitely confuse you. So inside of the create serializer, notice that I'm accessing the image, the title, and the body through the validated data, and also the author actually too right here. But inside of the update serializer, I'm accessing it through the data that's being passed through the validate method, so through this blog post. The reason I have to do it I can't access the validated data in the update serializer is because the form hasn't been validated yet. So if you look at the view, the validation occurs right here. So the serializer has not been validated yet, so we can't access validated data. But when we are dealing with the create serializer, the form or the serializer has already been validated at this point. And it's already been validated at this point. Well, you'll see in a second here when we add the view. So I'm going to save this and you'll see what I'm talking about. So there's our serializer. Now we're going to go into the view and we need to add our new create serializer view. So copying that from the same gist that I was just talking about. Remember that we need to add the BlogPostSerializer. So scrolling up to the top, we need to write comma BlogPostSerializer. Going back to the gist, and now I'm going to, I should have added this, need to add this constant too, create success. So adding that right here, and then copy this this new view. So copying all that, going back, now finding the create view right here. So pasting over that, and now I'll talk about what I mean by the serializer has been validated, so we can access the validated data. So if you come down here, it's mostly the same. Checks for a request. In this case, it's a post request. It gets the data, so it gets the author, passes, and then so this is important actually too, because when we're creating the blog post, the blog post object does not have access to the author by default. We have to get the author through the token, which is passed through the request. So here we're getting the request data, and then we're appending the author to it from the request. So request.user.primary key is the author, and then we're passing that data to the serializer. So that's important. So after that, the serializer is validated. So at this point, it has access to the validated data. So this validated data right here. Then it saves it. So blog post equals serializer.save. And that's calling the save method right here. So that's why it's able to access the validated data, because this has been validated. Whereas in the update view, so if we look at this, the validation is performed right here. So we can't get the validated data because the serializer isn't validated yet. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So now let's go down to the create and just go through this. So the rest is just creating the response, attaching all of the parameters, again removing the signature from that image, and everything else is pretty straightforward, pretty much the same. So pressing Control S, and now we can test this. So I'm going to open up Postman, go to the create URL. We have got to make sure that the correct header is attached. So I'm going to copy this, paste that in for the token. That's one that's valid on the server. We know that's valid. And now try to create one of these blog posts. So if I go to the server, let's go to the home screen, and I'll create a brand new one actually. So let's go to Postman again. This is a new post, all capitals. And that was the body. Okay, that's fine. So we need to make sure the body is really long. So I'm typing a whole bunch of characters. The title will be, I'll just say new title with a whole bunch of exclamation marks and question marks. And then an image. So we need to add an image, do file, make sure. So we'll test those images like we did last time too. So this one was too big. So we'll attach the one that we know is definitely too big. Let's hit send, says that it's too big. That's good. Now we'll do one that is, the size is correct, but the aspect ratio is wrong. So that one, it says it doesn't meet the criteria again. So that's good. And now let's attach one that will definitely work. Let's go to, I don't know, doesn't matter. This one, that one's a good size, and the width and the height is good. Hit send, and there we go. We get that new blog post created. We can confirm that by going to the server, refreshing the home page, and there we have that new blog post. So that seems to be working correctly. So next we need to change the way registration is done. So I'm actually going to close all of these because we're kind of done in the blog section for now. So closing all of these, and I'm actually going to bring the OpenAPI Android app on the screen here. So when you go to register, so if I try to register somebody who already exists on the server, so I'm going to do just password, and this is accessing the actual production server that I have. So I have an email that definitely already exists on the server, and also a username that already exists. So if I click register, it says that email is already in use. Good. So now suppose I do one that doesn't already, I shouldn't probably do that. Yeah, it doesn't matter. So this email obviously doesn't exist, but this username does exist. So now if I try register again, it says that username is already in use. Those are the errors that we should be reading from the server through the server code. So we need to change our registration response a little bit. So I'm going to go to the account app, go into views.py, and I want to change this registration view because currently the way that this is handling the registration is not doesn't really give any useful information. It gives some kind of weird response or default response that's not really helpful. So we want to customize this basically. So again, I've created a gist like always. We need to grab these imports first of all. Going to add those to the top here. So we have API view, authentication classes, permission classes. Now going back to the gist, and I'm going to copy this new registration. There's a lot of stuff here, so copy all of that, and we're going to paste that over the registration view. So let's walk through this. So pressing Control S, and let's see what we're dealing with. So registration requires no permission classes and no authentication classes, because anybody should be able to register, anybody should be able to authenticate when they're registering. So it's very important that these are included at the top here. Now let's look at the view. So if the request is a post request, we want to check the email. So I'm getting the email field. So then we want to call the validate email function, which is defined down here, which all this is doing is it checks to see if that email already exists on the server. If it doesn't, it returns the email. If it does, then it returns none. So, oh wait, is that how it works? So if account equals none, get the account. If the account does not exist, return, yeah, so if the account doesn't exist, it returns none. Otherwise, it returns the account. So then in here, if the email does not equal none, meaning it already exists on the server, then we return a response that email is already in use, which is what you saw in the Android app. So that was the username one, but the email one was very similar. So that's what this does for the email, and then it does the same thing for the username. So these two checks right here are confirming the email is okay, and the username is also not in use. Next, we create our registration serializer. So we were doing this before, no big deal, passing the data. Check if, so these are the only two checks really we need to make sure. It's like if the username exists, if the email exists, then we can move on to what we were doing regularly before. I also edited the response though. So we save the account, we get a reference to that account, and then we return a response. So response, successfully registered new user, return the email, username, primary key, the token, and yeah, that's it. And if the serializer is not valid, then we return serializer.errors. Pretty straightforward, you know, nothing too crazy there. Just returning some data. But one thing I will point out right now, if you didn't notice, is pay attention to the way that I'm building these responses. So every time there is a successful response or an error response, notice I'm attaching this response kind of parameter here, this response field. And I did this for every one of the responses that we looked at so far. So if I go into blog and I go into views, notice I attached that same field. So this is kind of like the identifier and it's the same always. So no matter what in the app, I can always look for that response field, and then I know if it was successful or it failed. See response, 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 they're all there and they're all the same. So when we're actually parsing that data from the Android app, from the client side, we know that we can consistently look for this response field, and it will give us either a success message or a failure message. All right, so now let's, I press Control S to save that, and I'm gonna go to Postman and we're gonna check this. I think I have this all ready to go. Yeah, so there's account register. We don't need to attach anything as a header because remember we have no authentication required, no permissions required. Now we're just going to test this. So I'm going to do testing123@gmail.com, testing123. And I don't, we actually want to test to make sure that we can't register users that already exist. So let's go to accounts and look for something that already exists. I already have testing123 and testing123@tabian.ca, so let's use that as a test. So testing123@tabian.ca, username is testing. So these already exist on the server, so this should not work. So let's click send. It says that email is already in use. There's our error response. That's fine. So now I'll do testing123.4, but notice the username is already in use. So click that. It says successful. So that I don't think that should have passed. Let's just confirm that testing. Okay, so testing123 was not the username, it was test123. So that worked. So we still need to test the username. Well, now that we've created a user with that name, I'll just add a 5 here, click send, and it should say, yeah, that username is already in use. So that is all working correctly. All right, so that's it. Now let's move on to the last correction. So the last thing that we want to fix is actually nothing that really technically needs to be done, but probably you guys will want this done because it doesn't work correctly on the server right now. So if I go to the server and I search, you know, something in the search bar, I get responses, right? That's fine. But if I was to click on one of these, so I'm viewing a blog post, and then I was to do that same search, notice that I don't get I don't get any responses. So if I was to search that same thing on the home screen, so I'll go home, I'll search new, notice that I get two responses. But if I click on one of these blog posts and I search the same thing, notice I don't get anything. So basically what's happening here is the search functionality is not working on any screen except for the home screen. So it only works here. So that's obviously a problem. You will want to fix that. So we can fix that. It's pretty straightforward. So let's go to Sublime Text, and we need to go into header.html. So I'm going to templates, going into snippets, and going into header.html. So what's happening here is the request isn't getting submitted when it's not on anything except for the home screen. So we need to build a little script that can kind of override this behavior. So I'm creating a new JavaScript script inside of here, and I'm going to create a new function. So function, it's going to be called execute query. It doesn't take any parameters. It'll have a single variable query equals document.getElementById. That ID is going to be ID underscore Q. So it's going to be this element right here, this input. So I'm getting that parameter, getting the value that's stored in there. And then I want to write window.location.replace. And then I want to write basically what I want to do is no matter what page I'm on, I want to redirect to the home screen and execute that query. So because that's the problem here. So if I'm at the home screen, the query works fine. That works good. I get results. But if I'm at any other page, the reason it doesn't work is because it's not set up to work like this. Oops, I need a question mark here. But it's not set up to work like that. So notice that I don't get any responses. I'm still seeing the same page. What we want it to do is to return to the home screen and do this, because that will be the correct behavior. So we need to kind of override that and force it to do that. So in here, I'm going to write http ://127.0.0.1 :8000 / q equals whatever that query is going to be. So plus the query. And if you're in production, obviously you need to replace this with your production environment. For me, that would mean if you're following the Powerful Android Apps course, it would be HTTPS. Well, if you're following the Powerful Android Apps course and you're just going to use OpenAPI, you don't need to worry about any of this. But if you're using your own domain, your own server to do this, you'll need to replace your domain. So you would just do q equals, and then you would close that off and do plus query. So that's what you would put this thing and put it inside here. So just replacing this, but obviously we're testing right now, so I'm referencing the local host. And then I want to return false. This is very important because I want to I don't want this form to submit like normal. I want this behavior to be the one that denotes what happens. So where I'm going to call this makes a difference. That was a really bad description, but I'll explain it again when I come up here. We don't need this get method. All we need to do is do on submit, reference the method and return false. So I'm writing return here because whether or not I use this form will depend on the execute query method. So what I'm saying here is on submit, return the value from execute query, and execute query is going to return false. If it returns false, it means that we are not going to use this form, the default behavior of the form. Basically, this is disabling the form. And so instead what will happen is this right here, which will manually set the browser location to this, which will then execute our query. So we're kind of doing some overriding, some non-default behavior, and there's probably an easier way to do this. I would call this kind of a hacky solution, but I'm not a web developer, so I'm not super good at web development. I'm sure you could find a more elegant solution to this. So now that we've altered the header.html file, we need to alter the home screen view. So going into personal, going into views, we need to alter this home screen view. And I have created a gist to make this easy. I think I posted it up here. Yeah, so this gist again will be in the description of the video. Here's the changes that I made to the header.html. Now I'm going to copy this home screen view, go back to the project, and paste this in. So I don't think there's very much changes. Like if I undo that, there's not much that's changed. Just a few changes. I think I just removed this if. Yeah, I just removed like this if statement. Nothing really changed here. I think you probably could have left that. The main changes were in the header. So now that that's changed, let's go to the server and go to the home screen. That's all fine. I'm going to click on one of these blog posts. I'm going to make a search. So what we expect to happen here is that I get redirected to the home screen with this search executed. So if I click that, yes, I'm redirected to the home screen and that search is executed. So that's good. And we want to confirm that also on the home screen, everything still works correctly. So if I remove the query and I search the same thing, I get the same behavior. So everything is working as we expect. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. I know this video was long, but I really did not. I just want to get this done because I want to move on to the OpenAPI Android app. I don't think a lot of people are watching the REST API course anyway. Like if you take a look at my GitHub and you go to the Coding with Mitch blog course REST API, there's only a few stars. Not very many people are watching this, so I didn't think it was really a good use of time for me to spend a whole bunch of time working on this. I kind of more or less just want to get it done and move on to the stuff that most people really want to see, which is the Android app, which I was briefly kind of showing you as we went through these updates. So that's going to be it for this video. Once again, just to remind you, for those of you who don't know, for what I've been talking about with the OpenAPI Android application, that's going to be this powerful Android apps with Jetpack Architecture course on my website. So we're using all kinds of good stuff: Kotlin, MVI architecture, navigation components, Room, coroutines, retrofit, Dagger, REST API integration. And to confirm, it's going to be interacting with OpenAPI.xyz, which is the server that we put up, which it's a production version of what we've been updating in this video. It interacts with this REST API, and that is going to be this application right here. So pretty cool stuff. Really looking forward to this app. I know a lot of you have been waiting for it for a long time. So hopefully I can start publishing lectures ASAP. I will see you in that next video.